Hi guys, and welcome back to Contract B. This is the final part in our 4-part series on duress, undue influence and unconscionable conduct. And finally, last but not least, we have unconscionable conduct. So here we are back at our Resi presentation and we're in for part 4, unconscionable conduct. Now, the big thing that separates unconscionable conduct from either duress or undue influence is the fact that you are not looking at the nature or the quality of assent of the weaker party. What you are looking at is the conduct of the stronger party, and particularly here we are looking at where the stronger party takes advantage of what the court sees as the weaker party's special disadvantage or serious disability. What you need to prove here, your 3 elements: one party is in that position of special disadvantage, the other party knows or ought to know, so constructive notice is sufficient here, and that they go ahead and the dominant party takes advantage of their position. The main case that we will look at for unconscionable conduct is the case of Commercial Bank of Australia and Mardio. And I'm sure, again, this will be one of those cases that is emblazoned on your memory. It's rather an extraordinary set of circumstances. Very nicely encapsulates pretty much everything you need to see in a case of unconscionable conduct. Here we had the main protagonist being Vincenzo Amadio. He was the son of Mr. and Mrs. Amadio. He was, as I say there, a rather flashy businessman. He used to hold outrageous parties. There was a Christmas party of over 2,000 people that he invited. Vincenzo had a very special relationship with the commercial bank near him. The bank liked him, obviously. He was an important customer. He had business interests with the bank. He brought in further business for the bank from his network of affiliates. And he also, very interestingly, was engaged in a joint venture property development with one of the bank's subsidiaries. So the bank and he were pretty cosy in a nice kind of way.
No one has ever loved you as I love you.
Unfortunately for Vincenzo, though, his lavish lifestyle wasn't really affordable, and his companies were pretty much insolvent. What he did do was meet with the bank manager rather regularly to decide which checks that his company would honour and which checks they would bounce. This enabled Vincenzo to carry on business with his company under the somewhat mistaken impression by his customers that he was actually solvent when his company was not. Finally, the bank had enough of exposing themselves to further debt that was being run up by Vincenzo, and they put a freeze on his company's accounts. They told him that he couldn't withdraw any more money. His account was already overdrawn. So what did Vincenzo do? Well, he goes to the bank manager and he says, well, actually, I've been up the road to the Bank of New South Wales and they're pretty happy to have my business. I've opened an account with them and they are prepared to give me an overdraft if I provide security over an office building that my parents own. Now, this was a big fat porky pie. So Vincenzo says, if you want to keep my business, Commercial Bank, you'll offer me an overdraft with the same kind of terms. I can provide you with the same kind of security for the increased drawings on the account. The bank, Mr. Virgo, who knew Vincenzo very well, said yes if he would gradually chip away at the debt that was owing to the bank. So I think at that point it was about 270,000, and it was to be reduced pretty darn quickly because the bank was getting a bit nervous. Vincenzo goes ahead and asks his parents for security. However, here he carries on his litany of lies and says to his parents, look, don't worry, it's only going to be for a liability of about $50,000 for about 6 months. So it's a fairly low-key kind of security that you would be providing for my company. So what happened then? Well, as I said before, this case pretty much has everything so far as unconscionable conduct is concerned. The majority certainly thought so. We had a very large mortgage document presented to Mr. and Mrs. Amadio. Interestingly, it was presented to them by Mr. Virgo, the bank manager, in the confines of their own little home. The decision says that they were in their kitchen and Mr. Virgo comes in with this very large mortgage document. Mr. Amadio was reading the paper. Mrs. Amadio was washing some dishes. Both of them had a limited grasp of written English, so they couldn't read the document terribly well. And in any event, the court notes that the document was so lengthy it would discourage careful perusal by, even a seasoned English speaker. The mortgage was unlimited by amount, so certainly not limited to the $50,000, unlimited by time, so not limited to the 6 months. And poor old Mr. and Mrs. Amadio were to pay for the whole of Vincenzo's indebtedness. Now, this would pretty much signal financial ruin for them, and the court says so, because the little office block that they'd put on the line wasn't even enough to pay for the large amount of Vincenzo's debt. So it would be financial suicide to sign this thing. Mr. and Mrs. Amadio didn't bother reading the document. There was one comment by Mr. Amadio saying, oh, this is only for 6 months. And Mr. Virgo said, oh, no, it's not limited to 6 months. And he let it go at that, rather incredibly. He didn't actually go ahead and check to make sure that the Amadios actually understood what they were about to sign. And then they just went ahead and signed the document. They didn't get a copy of the document. They didn't hear anything further about this transaction from March 77 when they signed through to December 1978. So well on the way to 2 years later, when it all goes very pear-shaped for Vincenzo's companies and the bank calls in the security. Justice Dean, as I said, had the principal decision here, and he just explains the principles of equity stepping in for unconscionable conduct. You have that stronger party, you have a weaker party with a special disability, and he flags some useful indicia of special disability from a case called Blomley and Ryan. And they are poverty or need of any kind, sickness, age, sex, infirmity of body or mind, drunkenness, illiteracy, lack of education, lack of assistance or explanation, where assistance and explanation are necessary. All up, there has to be one party at a special disadvantage or a serious disadvantage vis-a-vis the other. Here we certainly have a special disability on the part of Mr. and Mrs. Amadio. Obviously, the bank was in a very dominant position, so it knew about the company's dealings, Vincenzo's company's insolvency, the overdrawn accounts. They just wanted to get their hands on this mortgage, all signed, sealed and delivered to relieve their nervousness about Vincenzo's debt. On the other hand, Mr. and Mrs. Amadio were fairly old, had little grasp of written English, as I said. They relied on Vincenzo to manage their business. They thought he was successful. Really? They were approached in their kitchen, as I said, so very informal setting there for the execution of what was a very serious document that would, the court even notes, as I said before, would probably represent their financial ruin. The document was complicated. They had no advice. Really, the main thing that the court latches onto is this business of them lacking assistance and advice where it was plainly necessary. Now, the question was, could the transaction be set aside as between the bank and Mr. and Mrs. Amadio? So the question was, did the bank know what Mr. Virgo knew? And the court said yes, of course it did. What did Mr. Virgo know, though? Did he know about Mr. and Mrs. Amadio's special disability or serious disadvantage? The bank tried to weasel out of it by saying that it relied on a representation, hello, another porcupine, by Vincenzo, that he'd explained the transaction fully to his parents. The court dismisses this reliance on Vincenzo's representation as having unimpressively sparse evidence for it. There was no representation that he had explained the transaction fully. It was pretty obvious the bank was just trying to get out of this. There was no proper basis for assuming that Mr. and Mrs. Amadio got proper advice. The document was huge, not even lawyers would want to read it. The bank manager knew that Mr. and Mrs. A hadn't read the thing until that day, so how could he think that they had proper advice on it when it was just plopped on the table for their execution? Really, the next point, though, is the kicker. Mr. Amadio's comment in relation to the 6 months misnomer showed that he and Mrs. A were seriously misinformed as to a basic term of that mortgage. Okay, when Mr. Virgo heard that comment by Mr. Amadio, he was put on inquiry. That is, it was pretty darn obvious that they didn't know what they were signing, and he should have made sure that they knew what they were signing. They needed assistance and explanation. They certainly did not get it. Mr. Virgo just corrected the misnomer of the 6 months, went on, let them sign the document in willful ignorance of their special disability. So the court says that's not distinguishable from actual knowledge of their special disability. The reasonable person in that situation would certainly have been put on notice that they needed further explanation, and they would have made sure that the explanation occurred. So the execution and the trying to then enforce the agreement in such circumstances was unconscionable, and the whole transaction was set aside. Yay for Mr. and Mrs. Amadio. And that is CBA and Amadio. Really was a watershed case that very firmly installed unconscionable conduct as a very handy equitable vitiating factor. Okay, so here we have Lavender Price, which is a case of unconscionable conduct in a very different setting. And here the special disability was love. You got it, infatuation.
You are a girl, I am a boy.
Here, poor old Mr. Louth was completely in love and infatuated with Miss Diprose. Miss Diprose really wasn't that into him, unfortunately for him. However, she did stick around because, she got the good stuff, she got material benefits, he gave her things. And the relationship started off in Tasmania, it was off, it was on, and then it kind of went over to Adelaide. At this point, she was living in Adelaide with some relatives, and the relatives' marriage broke down. They wanted to get rid of the house. She used that opportunity to, the court said, manufacture a false atmosphere of crisis. And she said to Mr. Louth, look, I really need this money to buy this house off of my relatives. Otherwise, my kids and I are going to be out in the street. They're going to evict us, and I don't think I could handle that. I would just kill myself. Now, of course, this was terrifying to poor old Mr. Louth. He couldn't imagine the world without Ms. Diprose in it. And, of course, he gave her around $60,000 odd to buy the house for her and her kids.
I'd get a kick out of her.
Obviously, at some point, Mr. Louth comes to his senses and sues to recover the money. The court had a look at the issue of emotional dependence, and they said he certainly was emotionally dependent on her. He was completely in love, completely infatuated, just wanted whatever it was that she would give him. And because of this vulnerability, when she manufactured this false atmosphere of crisis very cruelly, it was just a terrible thought to him, and he really was in a position of serious disadvantage or special disability. The court very clearly disapproved of Miss Diprose's conduct and kind of paints her as a rather wicked woman, saying that she used his love and infatuation plus added in some deceit to get whatever it was that she wanted, and in this case it was the house. They said that Mr. Louth had gone to Ms. Diprose, had asked for the money very reasonably. She had cruelly refused him, and so he was thrown back on his appeal to the court. The transaction obviously was most improvident, but the court kind of very loudly paints an exclamation point in their decision when they say, well, equity won't just step in to protect foolishness. So obviously this transaction was foolish from Mr. Louth's point of view, but it would also protect against victimisation. And here, poor old Mr. Louth had been victimised by this cruel woman. Another one of those contract B cases that you just won't forget in a hurry. Unconscionable conduct, but in a very different setting to CBA and Amadio. So that's Louth and Diprose. The last thing I want you to have a quick look at is the Australian Consumer Law, sections 20 and 21, and in fact 22 should be in the heading there as well. Section 20 is a prohibition on unconscionable conduct within the meaning of the unwritten law. What does that mean? Well, the explanatory memorandum very usefully says it's intended to cover the kind of unconscionable conduct that you see in cases like CBA and Amadio. So no real rocket science there. What it does do is it unlocks those goodie bags of remedies in sections 236 and 237, which we've spoken about ad nauseum so far in Contract B. So that's section 20. Sections 21 and 22 deal with unconscionable conduct in connection with goods or services, and 22 is the provision that gives you a nice little bullet list of the kinds of indicia that will flag to a court that unconscionable conduct may be in the wings somewhere. So have a little look at that. The text explains it quite nicely. It also goes on to talk about the Contracts Review Act. That is a New South Wales local act, so I won't go into that here, but you can explore that in the text at your leisure. So that is unconscionable conduct. And like I always say, if you have any queries or questions, please email me, tweet me, message me, facey me, and we can sort it all out, I'm sure. Other than that, I look forward to seeing you soon in a Zoom session, and thanks for watching. Bye guys.